The blizzard that struck Cold Creek on February 9th, 1884, arrived without warning and without mercy. Within 22 minutes, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. The sky did not darken the way storms usually announce themselves slowly with the courtesy of gathering clouds and shifting winds. It changed all at once, the way a candle goes out when someone cups their hand around the flame. One moment, Cold Creek was a small Montana Territory town going about its ordinary afternoon business. The next moment, the world turned the color of old bruises, yellow and black and wrong, and the wind came howling from the north like something that had been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. The snow did not fall. It came from everywhere at once, pouring through the streets like floodwater, made of ice, finding every gap in every wall, every crack beneath every door, every seam that the people of Cold Creek had trusted for years to hold the cold at bay. By nightfall, visibility was zero. By morning, 8 people were dead, but 27 others were alive. They were huddled inside a limestone cave on the eastern edge of town, a cave that the entire population of Cold Creek had spent 2 years calling the Mad Woman's Hole. And the woman who built it, the woman who had dug it from raw rock with bleeding hands, while her neighbors laughed at her and bet money on the day she would die, in there was named Margaret Holbrook. She was 52 years old, a widow, a woman with no children left living, a former Army nurse who had watched men bleed out on tables that were really just doors laid across wooden horses, who had learned to work fast and feel later who had buried a grief so large inside herself that it had either broken her completely or transformed her into something the people of Cold Creek did not have a word for. 27 people alive because of her. 8 people dead because they would not listen to her. This is the story of how that cave came to be. And it does not begin with rock and limestone. It begins with 15 feet of snow and 2 voices calling in the dark and a red-brown dog pressing himself against 2 frozen bodies as though he believed even at the very end that his warmth was enough to hold death back. It begins in March of 1879, 5 years before the Great Storm. The wagon train stretched across the Montana prairie like a long wound in the earth, 63 souls making their way toward a life they had not yet lived. Farmers and their families, dreamers, people who had decided that whatever they had back in Missouri was not enough, and that the territory to the west held something better waiting for them in the distance. They had been traveling for weeks when the landscape shifted from rolling grassland to something rougher, something that pressed up against the horizon with the weight of permanence. The oxen moved with their heads low. The children had stopped asking how much farther. The adults had stopped pretending they knew. Margaret Holbrook was 47 years old, and she walked beside the lead wagon with the steady gait of a woman who had spent 3 years on her feet during the worst conflict this country had ever seen. She had been an Army nurse. She had sewn soldiers back together after battles that turned ordinary fields into landscapes no painter would ever choose to capture. She had held the hands of boys who were still calling for their mothers when the last breath left them. She had seen things that changed the shape of a person from the inside out, the way water changes stone slowly over years until the original surface is something you can only guess at. She thought nothing could break her anymore. She was 47 years old. She had survived the war. She had come home to a man named Everett Holbrook, and in the years since she had learned the particular gratitude of someone who expected nothing and received everything. Everett walked on the other side of the lead wagon, guiding the oxen with the quiet patience that had made her fall in love with him 20 years before. He was a tall man with large hands and a way of moving through the world that never seemed to require anyone else to get out of his way. The kind of man who could calm a frightened horse with 3 words spoken low. The kind of man whose presence in a room made the temperature feel slightly warmer without anyone being able to explain exactly why. When Margaret watched him walk, she felt a gratitude so deep it sometimes frightened her. She had survived the war. She had come home to this. She had been given a second chance at a life that made sense. Behind them, their son Stellan drove the second wagon. He was 16 years old, already taller than his father, with Everett's gentle eyes and Margaret's stubbornness embedded in the set of his jaw. He was dreaming about Montana the way only a 16-year-old can dream about a place he has never seen, with absolute certainty that it will be exactly as he has imagined it. Their dog Buck rode in the back of Stellan's wagon, a red-brown animal of indeterminate breed with one white ear and the calm, watchful disposition of a creature that had decided long ago that wherever these particular people went, that was where he would go too. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was clear and the March sun was doing its thin best against the cold. The next moment, the world went white and the wind hit the wagon train with a force that staggered the oxen and sent canvas ripping from the wagon hoops like paper. The temperature dropped so fast that the change was not gradual. It was a fact. One moment it was cold. The next moment it was something else entirely. Something the word cold is not quite large enough to contain. Everett and Stellan had gone to gather firewood, just 30 feet from the wagon, a distance a man could cover in seconds on an ordinary day. Margaret heard them call. She heard their voices for 20 minutes, Everett calling her name, Stellan calling for help, their voices scattered by the wind until the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the prairie itself had swallowed them and was simply replaying their voices for its own cold amusement. She tried to walk toward them. The wind knocked her down. She crawled on her hands and knees, calling back, streaming into the white nothing until her throat felt like raw meat. She could not see her own hand in front of her face. The snow was not falling so much as existing everywhere at once, a solid white presence that had replaced the air. Her fingers found the crack in the rock. She did not know there was a limestone outcropping there. She had not noticed it in all the days they had been traveling through this stretch of ground. But her hands found it in the white blindness, a narrow opening between two slabs of stone, barely wide enough for a person to turn sideways and squeeze through. She scraped skin from her arms and her cheek, pressing herself inside. And then suddenly the wind was gone. The howling that had been trying to push her mad was replaced by silence. The temperature inside the crack was not warm, but it was warmer. Not comfortable, but survivable. The difference between those two things in that moment was the same as the difference between everything and nothing. She called for Everett and Stellan until her voice gave out completely. She screamed their names into the white nothing beyond the crack until she tasted blood in the back of her throat. The storm screamed back indifferent, as only weather can be indifferent, with the total absence of malice that is somehow worse than malice because there is nothing to reason with, nothing to appeal to, nothing that can be asked for mercy. They never answered. For 3 days, Margaret huddled in that limestone crack with no food and no water, except what she could lick from the damp stone walls. She prayed, she wept, she lay in the darkness and spoke to Everett and Stellan as though they could hear her telling them things she had never thought to say, when there was time to say them all, the accumulated gratitude of 20 years that she had always assumed she would express later, when there was more time, when they were settled in Montana, when the house was built and the land was planted, and life had found its ordinary rhythm again. The silence of the third day was worse than the screaming of the first, because by the third day, she knew. On the fourth morning, the storm broke. Margaret crawled out into a white world that looked like nothing she had ever seen. The wagons were buried. The cattle were dead where they stood, frozen in postures of ordinary life that would have been almost peaceful if not for the stillness. She found a family she had known since Missouri, all 5 of them parents wrapped around their 3 children in a final embrace that would last until spring. 47 of the 63 people in that wagon train were dead. She found Everett and Stellan 15 feet from the crack in the limestone. 15 feet. They had been trying to reach her. She could see it in the way their bodies were oriented, angled toward the rock face, toward the narrow crack she had squeezed into. They had been moving in the right direction. They had been close enough that if the storm had given them 30 more seconds, if the wind had dropped for 1 single minute, if visibility had returned for the length of a breath, they would have found it. They would have lived. They would have crawled out on the 4th morning the same way she crawled out, trembling and half mad with thirst and grief, but breathing. They would have held each other in the cold white morning and wept with something that would eventually become relief. They would have continued on to Montana. They would have built the house Stellan had been dreaming about since Missouri. 15 feet. Buck was lying between them, his body pressed against Everett on one side and Stellan on the other, as if he had spent the last hours of the storm trying to warm them both with the only thing he had left to offer. He was still breathing, barely. His ribs moved in shallow, rapid shivers, and his eyes, when they found Margaret, held an expression that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never quite manage. He had stayed, when staying meant dying. He had pressed himself against the two people he loved and refused to leave them. Margaret knelt in the snow and pressed her face against Everett's frozen cheek. She stayed like that for a long time, long enough for the cold to begin working on her again. Then Buck crawled to her, moving with tremendous effort on legs that had forgotten how to work properly, and he pushed his head against her chest, and she felt his whole body trembling so violently it was almost like a sound. She picked him up and held him against her coat, sharing what warmth she had left. Then she began to walk. She walked 2 miles through the white wreckage of everything she had built before she found other survivors. She never once put Buck down. 3 years passed the way years pass after loss. Slowly, and then all at once, and then slowly again. Margaret worked as a nurse in mining camps across Montana Territory, the kind of camps where men lost fingers and sometimes whole hands, and occasionally their lives, to the mountains they were trying to hollow out for silver. She cooked in hotels. She mended clothes. She took whatever work would keep her fed and give her a reason to open her eyes in the morning. Buck was always with her. He slept at the foot of whatever narrow bed she had rented for the week and followed her from camp to camp with the quiet loyalty of a creature who had made his decision long ago and saw no reason to revisit it. Every night she heard Everett calling her name. Every night she saw Stellan's face in the snow. She did not stop hearing those voices for 3 years. She is not sure she ever stopped entirely. But somewhere in the second year, a thought began to take shape, not like a revelation. More like the way a photograph develops in a dark room, slowly the image becoming clearer, until suddenly you can see the whole thing and wonder why you did not recognize it sooner. She had survived because of the crack in the limestone. The earth itself had protected her when the sky tried to kill her. Her father had taught her about this. Arthur Briggs, a Cornish miner who had spent 40 years working underground in the silver mines of Colorado, who had emerged from the earth every evening covered in dust and smelling of stone, and who had explained to Margaret when she was small exactly why the underground worked the way it worked. The earth maintains a constant temperature, he used to tell her. Not too warm, not too cold. 54 degrees in summer, 54 degrees in winter. It does not matter what the weather does up above. Blizzard or drought. The earth does not change its mind. The sky can turn on you in an instant. The earth keeps its promises. He had lived to be 83. 40 years underground, and he had lived to be 83. Everett and Stellan had died 15 feet from that promise. If the crack had been bigger. If there had been supplies stored inside. If someone had prepared a shelter in the limestone. A real shelter, large enough for a family, large enough for a wagon train stocked with food and water and warmth, and the knowledge of how to make warmth last, her husband and her son would still be alive. They would have found it. They had been moving in the right direction. They would have found it in those last 15 feet. The thought that transformed her grief into something else was this: someone could have built that shelter. It was not impossible. It was not even particularly difficult for a person who knew what they were looking at and was willing to do the work. Her father had shown her what to look for. The earth had limestone formations all across Montana Territory. Somebody could have been there first. Somebody could have prepared it. Nobody had. That was the thought. Simple enough to hold in two hands. Heavy enough to change the direction of a life. In the spring of 1882, Margaret Holbrook arrived in Coal Creek, Montana Territory. She was 50 years old, a widow, a woman with no children left living and nothing left to lose, which is a different kind of freedom than most people ever know. She had lost everything that mattered, and in the strange mathematics of grief that had made her free to do the one thing that needed to be done, the thing that was foolish by every standard anyone around her would apply, the thing that would make her look exactly like a woman who had lost her mind. She bought 40 acres of rocky, worthless land on the eastern edge of town. The land cost almost nothing because nobody wanted it. Too rocky to farm. Too far from any water source. No practical use for a person of ordinary imagination. What it had was limestone cliffs and a small cave opening that most people walk past without noticing. Just a shadow between two slabs of rock. Easy to miss if you were not looking. Easy to miss even if you were. Margaret noticed. She moved into the cave the day she bought the land. What she found inside changed her plans from ambitious to extraordinary. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to turn sideways, But beyond that narrow gap, the cave opened into something she had not expected. A chamber large enough to stand up straight, walls of solid limestone carved by water over thousands of years, and passages, dark openings that led deeper into the earth, like questions that had been waiting a very long time for someone to come along and ask them. For 3 weeks she explored with nothing but a lantern and a ball of string, marking her path, never going farther than she could find her way back from. And with each day she discovered more. A second chamber larger than the first. A third chamber with a ceiling so high her lantern light could not reach it. And then on the 11th day, following a passage that narrowed until she had to crawl on her hands and knees, she found the spring. An underground spring. Water so clear she could see every grain of sand on the bottom. Water that ran steady and cold and constant 12 months a year, unaffected by drought, unaffected by freeze. Water that would never stop and never ice over because the earth, as her father had always told her, keeps its promises. The cave system was enormous, far larger than anyone in Cold Creek had any reason to suspect. Large enough to shelter 50 people, maybe more. She told no one. She had learned enough about the world to understand that telling people things before you showed them those things was mostly a way of giving them the opportunity to dismiss you before you had assembled your evidence. She would build the shelter first. She would make it ready. And when it was ready, when the time came, when people needed it, the caves would be there. She picked up her shovel and started to work. The work was not dramatic, which is perhaps why nobody wrote about it in newspapers or mentioned it in the kind of books that celebrate extraordinary things. It was just labor, day after day of labor, so physical and so relentless that most men half her age would have quit inside the first month. She hauled limestone rubble out of the main chamber by hand, load by load, in a canvas sling she had fashioned herself. She cut timber supports from the forest 20 miles away, trees thick enough to bear the weight of the earth above, and she dragged them on a makeshift sled one at a time over rough terrain that offered no particular sympathy for the effort. Each beam weighed close to 200 pounds. There were 18 of them before she was done. She smoothed the floor of the main chamber with a chisel and a hammer, breaking away the rough limestone surface, inch by inch, until a person could walk without stumbling, until an elderly man could move through without a cane, and a child could run without risk. This alone took 6 months of work on her hands and knees. She wore through 3 pairs of gloves. She broke 4 chisels. Her hands bled most days, healing at night and opening again in the morning until the skin on her palms grew so thick it was almost like leather. She carved niches into the walls for oil, lamps, each one positioned so that its light would reach the furthest corners without leaving pools of shadow where fear could collect. She tested configurations for weeks before she found the arrangement that satisfied her. She built sleeping platforms against the walls of the side chambers, rough but functional, covered in straw and wool. She dug a storage room in the rear of the system and began filling it. The ventilation shafts were the most difficult thing. Her father had taught her the principle. Warm air rises. If you create one shaft for air to enter at a low point and another for air to escape at a high point, the cave breathes on its own. No bellows, no machinery, just physics, reliable and indifferent, and always present the same physics that held the Earth's temperature constant at 54 degrees, summer and winter alike. She followed natural fissures in the limestone upward, widening them by hand, testing the airflow with a piece of thread tied to a stick, adjusting until the thread moved the way it was supposed to move. When she lit a fire in the main chamber and the smoke rose cleanly through the shaft and the air stayed breathable and cool, she sat back on her heels and allowed herself 1 minute of something she had almost forgotten the name of. Then she picked up the shovel and kept going. Buck sat at the cave entrance while she worked. Every day, every hour she was inside the cave, he sat at the entrance with the same patient vigilance, his red-brown body a fixed point against the changing light, watching her come and go with the cargo of rubble and timber and supplies. He did not understand what she was building. He understood that it mattered to her, and that was enough for him. At night, they slept inside the cave. The temperature held steady, 54 degrees, just as her father had promised. Outside the Montana Territory, winter pressed against the limestone walls with everything it had. Inside, the earth kept its promise. The first person from Cold Creek to come to her property was Ruth Calloway, the woman who ran the bakery on Main Street. She arrived on a Tuesday in the third week carrying a basket with 2 loaves of fresh bread and a jar of preserves, moving across the rocky ground in sensible boots, with the straightforward manner of a woman who had decided something and was going to do it. Margaret was hauling rubble when she arrived. Her dress was torn, her hands were bleeding. There was limestone dust in her hair and on her face, and she was aware that she looked exactly like what the town was already beginning to say she was. Ruth set the basket down on a flat rock and looked at the cave entrance without judgment. "Everyone in town thinks you've lost your mind," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "I lost my first husband to a mining accident," Ruth said. "Lost the second to cholera. I know the difference between a woman who's broken and a woman who's building something." She looked at the cave entrance again. "You're building something in." It was the first time in 3 years that anyone had said that to her. They did not talk for long. Ruth left the bread and went back to town. But she came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. She never stayed more than 20 minutes, never made promises she could not keep, never asked for anything in return. She just brought bread and stayed long enough to remind Margaret that she was not entirely alone in the world. It was enough. Some days it was more than enough. The second person to come to Margaret's property was Cole Harmon. He was 25 years old, the blacksmith's twin, with the broad shoulders of a man who had grown up around heavy work and the casual cruelty of someone who had never once been on the wrong side of a situation and so could not fully imagine what it felt like. He came on a Saturday afternoon with 2 friends from the saloon, and he did not come with bread. He stood at the edge of Margaret's property and looked at the cave entrance, and then at his friends, and then he made a show of taking money from his pocket. $5 says the cave collapses before Christmas, he announced loud enough for Margaret to hear from 30 feet away. 15 more says she's dead inside it before spring. He said it the way people say things when they have never been made to feel the weight of their words. Lightly, as if the life of a 50-year-old widow was a reasonable thing to wager on, as if the 2 years of bleeding hands and broken chisels and 54-degree nights were a joke whose punchline he was still waiting for. Margaret kept hauling rubble. She did not respond. She had learned in field hospitals during the war that some things are not worth the energy it costs to answer them, and she had spent enough years carrying that lesson that it had become instinct. Cole Harmon collected his side bets and walked back toward town laughing. She watched him go. Then she picked up the shovel. Imogen Price arrived on a Sunday afternoon in the company of 2 other women from the Ladies' Auxiliary. She was 48 years old, the mayor's wife, and she moved through Coal Creek with the particular authority of a woman who had learned early that social position is a kind of power and had never seen any reason to question whether it should be. She surveyed the cave entrance and the piles of rubble and the rough timber leaning against the limestone face, and her expression did exactly what Margaret had expected it to do. "You poor thing," Imogen said with a warmth in her voice that was not quite warmth. "Everyone can see you have been suffering, losing your family the way you did." She paused, letting the sympathy settle. "The Ladies' Auxiliary has been discussing your situation. We're prepared to take up a collection." "For what purpose?" Margaret said, not stopping work. "To help you find somewhere more appropriate, somewhere with proper care." Another pause. "There are institutions in Helena that specialize in women who've experienced significant trauma. I'm sure the doctor could write a recommendation." Margaret set down the rubble she was carrying. She looked at Imogen Price directly the way she had learned to look at things during the war, without flinching, without adding sentiment, just seeing what was actually there. "In 1873, a blizzard killed 200 people across Montana Territory," she said. "In 1876, another storm killed 84 in a single county. In 1880, a family of 7 froze to death 3 miles from this town. Their cabin was buried so deep they weren't found until spring." Imogen opened her mouth. "I came here to build a shelter," Margaret said. "Not to be saved. Thank you for the concern." Imogen Price left without another word, but the word she carried back to town was the word she had arrived with. And it spread the way those words always spread in small towns, quickly, thoroughly, until it was the kind of thing everyone knew without anyone being able to say exactly who said it first. Dr. Prentice Holt came to town on a Wednesday, which meant he found Margaret at the general store, exchanging furs for lamp oil, which meant the examination he had planned to conduct at her property became instead a public performance on the main street of Cold Creek with an audience of shopkeepers and passers-by who found reasons to slow down and not quite leave. He was 62 years old, a physician with degrees from institutions back east, and the particular confidence that accumulates in a man who has spent decades being the smartest person in every room he enters. He spoke to Margaret the way he spoke to patients he had already diagnosed. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, opening his leather notebook, "I've been asked by several concerned citizens to evaluate your state of mind." "My state of mind is clear," Margaret said. "Living underground is medically inadvisable," he said. "Studies indicate it leads to melancholia and respiratory disease." "Studies written by people who've never been underground," Margaret said. "The Earth maintains a constant temperature of 54 degrees. The air in a properly ventilated cave is cleaner than the air in any house with a wood stove. My father was a Cornish miner. He spent 40 years underground. He lived to be 83. Dr. Holt's pen paused above his notebook. He had prepared for confusion. He had prepared for defensiveness. He had not prepared for a woman who cited lung physiology on a Wednesday morning on Main Street while holding a jug of lamp oil. He closed the notebook without writing anything in it, but the word he carried back through town was the same word he would have written regardless of what she had said, and it was heavy enough coming from a doctor to settle into the ground like stone. Reverend Elias Cade delivered his opinion from the pulpit the following Sunday. Margaret did not attend his church, but she heard about it from Ruth, who came the next Tuesday with bread and a look on her face that combined indignation and the kind of tired resignation that comes from having watched human behavior for long enough to recognize its patterns. "He called you a pagan," Ruth said that God placed us above the earth, not beneath it, like worms. "What does he think roots are?" Margaret said. Ruth considered this for a moment. Then she put the bread down and went back to town. Mayor Aldous Price came in his official capacity on a Thursday morning, lone, wearing the kind of suit that signals a man's belief in his own significance. He was 58 years old and he owned the bank in the three best maintained buildings in Cold Creek. And he walked with the practiced ease of a man who had not been told no in a very long time. He stood at the edge of her property and looked at everything she had built with an expression Margaret recognized. It was the expression of someone who has already decided and is now simply managing the announcement. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, "Cold Creek is a growing town. We're trying to attract settlers and commerce. The territorial governor himself may visit next spring." "That's fine," Margaret said. "What you're doing here is not fine." He said, the pleasantness dropping out of his voice like something that had only been resting there temporarily. "A woman of your age living in a hole in the ground is an embarrassment to this community. I'm giving you fair warning. If this continues, there will be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Margaret asked. "Will you arrest me for working on land I purchased legally?" Mayor Price had no answer for that. The law was the law even in Cold Creek, and he knew it. He straightened his jacket and walked away without another word back toward the bank and the three best maintained buildings, and a problem that was not behaving the way problems were supposed to behave when you told them firmly to stop. What Margaret did not know, and would not know for 3 more years, was that Mayor Price's own land surveyor had examined the limestone formation on her property the previous spring before she arrived and had reported back to the mayor that the cave system at that location was the finest natural shelter site within 50 miles in every direction. Aldous Price had known this before Margaret bought the land. He had intended to buy it himself to build a community shelter that would bear his name and buy him votes and legacy. And then this woman had appeared from nowhere and bought it for almost nothing and was now building exactly what he had planned with her own hands, with her own money, in a way he could not claim and could not control. His contempt for her was not the contempt of a man who thinks a woman is foolish. It was the contempt of a man who knows she is right and cannot stand that she is right without him. And then there was Sheriff Harlan Voss. He was 55 years old. He had worn the badge in Cold Creek for 20 years, and he wore it the way some men wear their skin, as though it were simply part of what they were inseparable from the bones beneath. He was a practical man not given to sentiment or unnecessary conversation, the kind of man who was respected because he was reliable and feared a little because he was hard, and who had long ago concluded that these two qualities together were what keeping the peace in a small Montana Territory town actually required. He came to Margaret's property on a Saturday morning in October of 1882, 3 months after she had arrived. He came alone, which was different from the others. Margaret was hauling timber when he arrived. She stopped and looked at him. He looked at the cave entrance and then at her, and his face did a thing she had learned to read in field hospitals during the war, the particular stillness of a man who is working hard not to show something. "What in God's name are you doing, Mrs. Holbrook?" he said. "Building a shelter," she said. "You're living in a hole in the ground." "I'm preparing a place where people can survive when the weather turns. People have houses. Houses burn," she said. "Houses collapse. Houses can't keep you alive at 40 below, with 60-mile-an-hour winds trying to find every seam." He shook his head. The expression on his face was the expression of a man delivering a judgment he has already made. Everett would be ashamed to see his wife living like this. The words landed differently than he meant them to. Not because they hurt her. They did hurt her. But because of the specific name he had chosen. Not your husband, not a decent man. Everett. As though the name itself was a weapon he had personal access to. She looked at him for a long moment. "Everett died because there was no shelter," she said. "He died 15 feet from a crack in a rock that saved my life. If that crack had been larger, if it had been prepared, if someone had thought to make it ready before the storm came, my husband and my son would still be alive." "That was 5 years ago," Voss said. "In a different place." "The sky is the same sky everywhere," she said. He opened his mouth to argue. Then he closed it. He shook his head in the way of a man who has decided that further conversation is not worth his time, which Margaret recognized as its own kind of answer. He turned his horse and rode back toward town. "The cave is east of town," she called after him, "past the dead oak, between two limestone slabs. I'll leave a red cloth at the entrance. If you need it, come." He did not respond. She stood and watched him go, and for the first time in 2 years of building, she felt the weight of what she was carrying clearly enough to recognize it. Not the weight of the timber, not the weight of the rubble, the weight of being right about something that no one was willing to hear in a place where being right was not enough, where the only currency that mattered was the opinion of people who had already decided what you were. She went back inside and picked up the chisel. Among the faces that appeared in those 2 years, there were two that stood apart from the others, in the way that small kindnesses always stand apart from mockery, precisely because they require more courage and less reward. Old Clem Briggs came in the winter of 1883. He was 78 years old, and he moved across the rocky ground with a cane and a deliberateness that suggested he had decided long ago that slowness was not the same thing as weakness. He stood at the cave entrance for a long time before speaking. "You're the Briggs girl," he said. "Arthur's daughter, out of the Colorado silver camps." Margaret looked up from the ventilation shaft she was working on. She had not heard her father's name spoken aloud in 3 years. "I married and became a Holbrook," she said. "I worked with your father in Colorado in '56, Clem said. "He talked about you constantly. Said you understood rock the way most men understand horses. Said you were the smartest person he knew." He looked around the cave at the timber, supports, the lamp niches, the smooth floor, the ventilation shaft disappearing into the ceiling dark. His eyes moved slowly, and they were the eyes of a man who had spent his life reading the underground. He was right. This is beautiful work. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, the particular feeling of being seen by someone who understood what they were looking at. "I remember the storm of '47, Clem said quietly. "Killed 200 people across the territory. I survived because I found a cave. Not so different from yours." He looked at her. "I've been watching you work for a year, wondering if anyone in this town had the sense to listen." He paused. "They don't, but they will. People always listen when it's too late. The difference this time is that you'll be ready before they understand they need you." He turned and began making his slow way back toward town. "Keep building, Mrs. Holbrook," he said without looking back. "When the storm comes, and it will come, you'll be ready, and then they'll understand." Willa Greer was 19 years old and came nearly every week asking questions about limestone formation and underground water and the mathematics of air circulation through confined spaces. She was curious in the way that people are curious when they have already decided that curiosity is more important than other people's opinions of them. She always wore a coat that was slightly too large for her, even on days when the weather did not require it. "Does it bother you?" Willa asked one afternoon, sitting on a flat rock outside the cave entrance, watching Margaret work. "Knowing they're betting on your death." "It bothers me that they're spending money they could use to prepare for winter," Margaret said. "Do you really believe a bad storm is coming?" "A bad storm is always coming," Margaret said. "That's the thing people don't understand. They think because last winter was mild, this winter will be mild. They think because nothing terrible has happened yet, nothing terrible ever will." She paused. "That's not how the sky works." Willa was quiet for a moment. "My father thinks you're crazy." "Most people do." "I don't," Willa said. "I think you might be the only sane person in this town." Margaret stopped working and looked at the girl. "Why do you come here? You risk your reputation every time someone sees you walking this direction." Willa looked at her hands for a moment. "My mother died in a house fire when I was 12. The house was well built. The stove was maintained, everything was done correctly, and she still died." She looked up. "That day I learned that being ordinary doesn't protect you from disaster. Only being prepared does." Margaret held the girl's gaze for a moment. Then she said with the same directness she brought to everything, "If a storm comes, you bring your family here. Don't wait. Don't hesitate. Don't ask anyone's permission. Just come." "I will," Willa said. "I promise." By the summer of 1883, Margaret Holbrook had transformed the cave system into something the people of Cold Creek had never seen, mostly because none of them had ever gone inside to look. The main chamber was 40 feet deep, 25 feet wide, and 12 feet high. Every wall reinforced with timber. Every floor smooth enough for an elderly person to walk without looking down. The ventilation system worked exactly as her father had described it, drawing fresh air in through one shaft and pushing stale air out through the other, steady and silent, and requiring nothing but physics to keep it running. The storage room held enough dried meat and flour and preserved vegetables and beans to feed 50 people for 3 full weeks. The spring chamber had access to water that would never freeze. The sleeping area had 12 platforms. The medical station was stocked with bandages and the herbs she had learned to use in field hospitals when the real medicine ran out. She had spent every dollar she had. She had worked every day for 2 years until her hands bled and her back hurt in a way that no longer went away entirely when she rested. She had done all of it alone. And she was ready. Ready for whatever came. The town had a different word for ready. The town's word was crazy, and it had become over 2 years the kind of settled opinion that takes on the weight of established fact. The kind of thing that gets repeated so many times it stops needing any evidence to support it. Margaret knew this. She did not particularly care. She had built what needed to be built. The opinions could take care of themselves. One evening in late summer, she stood at the entrance to the cave and looked out at the Montana sky. It was beautiful, that particular western sky at the end of a clear day going orange and pink, and then a deep cold blue, the kind of blue that makes people feel small in the way that only the very large things can make a person feel small. Buck sat beside her, his red-brown coat going golden in the last of the light. He had been with her for 5 years, through all of it. Through grief and wandering, and 2 years of backbreaking labor in the dark while the world outside laughed. He had sat at this entrance every single day while she worked, watching her come and go with the rubble and the timber, and the tools, his tail thumping against the stone floor whenever she spoke to him. She scratched behind his white ear. "It's ready, boy," she said. He leaned against her leg. The Montana sky deepened into night. The temperature inside the cave held steady at 54 degrees, the same as it had held for thousands of years, the same as it would hold for thousands more. And somewhere to the north in the upper atmosphere, where weather is made, something was beginning to organize itself into a shape that the people of Cold Creek would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words for. Buck raised his head, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon. His ears went flat against his skull. Margaret watched him. She said nothing. She had learned 5 years ago in a different place to pay attention to what the dog knew before she did. She went back inside and began checking the supplies. The morning of February 9th, 1884 began the same way most mornings began in Cold Creek. Cold and clear and indifferent, the way Montana mornings are in the heart of winter, with a sky that offered no particular hints about what it was planning. The temperature was 28 degrees. There was no wind. The sun sat low on the southern horizon doing its pale winter, best catching the ice crystals on the pine branches and throwing small sparks of light across the snow. Margaret woke before sunrise the way she always did. She fed Buck. She checked her supplies, doing the mental inventory she had done every morning for the past 2 years, the same quiet accounting of what she had and what she might need and whether the two numbers were close enough together for comfort. She put on her coat and her boots and picked up her trap lines and turned toward the cave entrance. Buck did not move. He was sitting at the entrance, which was where he always sat when she was working inside. But she was not working inside. She was going out. And Buck had followed her out of that cave every single morning for 5 years in every kind of weather with the uncomplicated loyalty of a creature who had decided once that this was his person and had never revisited the decision. This morning he sat at the entrance and looked at her, and he did not get up. She stopped. He was not sick. His eyes were clear and present and focused, but not on her. On the northern horizon, his ears were flat against his skull, the same position they had been in the night before, the position that was not fear exactly, but something older than fear. Something that did not have a word in any human language, because humans had learned to stop needing that word when they built walls and roofs between themselves and the skin. Margaret crouched beside him. She put her hand on his back and felt the tension in the muscles there, the low vibration of an animal operating on information that her own senses were not yet delivering to her. She looked north. The horizon was clear. Nothing but dark pine and pale sky and the distant gray suggestion of the mountains. Nothing that a person would point to and say, there, that is the problem. She stayed crouched beside Buck for a long minute. Then she went back inside the cave. She set down the trap lines. She did not need to think about why. The thinking had already been done 5 years ago in a different place by a different version of herself who had not yet learned what she was now using. She went to the ventilation shaft and held her palm flat against the opening and felt the air moving across her skin. Then she pressed the first 2 fingers of her right hand against the space behind her left ear and held them there and waited. The pressure was there, a dull, specific ache that lived behind her eyes and at the base of her skull, the kind of headache that is not quite a headache, that is more like a message written in the language of barometric change delivered to the part of the brain that the body trusts before the mind catches up. She had felt it 3 times in her life before this morning. Twice during the war, before artillery barrages that the officers had not yet predicted. And once before, in March of 1879. She went to the entrance and listened. The birds were silent, not the ordinary quiet of an early winter morning. This was something else, something total. The scrub pines that normally held a population of small, brown birds from first light until dark were empty and still, as if every living thing with wings had received a message in the night and acted on it while the people of Cold Creek were still sleeping. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a room that has just been emptied of something essential. Margaret went back to Buck and looked into his eyes for a moment. Then she put on her heaviest coat and her thickest gloves and walked toward town at a pace that was just below running. She had maybe 4 hours, maybe fewer. Main Street was going about its ordinary business when she arrived. The general store had its door propped open. The smithy had smoke rising from its chimney. 2 men she did not know were loading a wagon outside the feed store, moving with the unhurried rhythm of people who believe they have the rest of the day to complete what they are doing. She went to Mayor Price first because he was the one person in Cold Creek with both the authority and the resources to move people quickly if he chose to use them. He was in his office at the bank behind a mahogany desk that was too large for the room, reviewing a ledger and holding a coffee cup. He looked up when she came through the door with the expression of a man being interrupted by something he has already categorized. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said with the tired patience of someone who has been through a version of this before. "I believe I've made my position clear." "There's a major storm coming," Margaret said. "It will arrive before dark. It will be worse than anything this territory has seen in years, possibly ever." He put the coffee cup down carefully, the way people do when they are managing their reaction to something. "And how exactly do you know this?" "The pressure is dropping. The birds have gone silent. The clouds on the northern horizon are the color of sulfur. These are signs I learned from my father, who spent 40 years reading the earth. They're the same signs I saw the morning of the storm that killed my family." Mayor Price looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man weighing the cost of what comes next against the cost of what he is about to say. Mrs. Holbrook, he said, we have weather every day. We do not cancel business and send people running to limestone caves because a woman who lives underground has a headache. This isn't weather, she said. It's a killing storm. People need to secure their livestock. They need extra firewood. They need to know where to go when their houses aren't enough. Go back to your hole, he said, and stop frightening people. She looked at him the way she had looked at men during the war when they were wrong about something that was going to cost lives, with the steady, contained look of a person who has already spent her anger on things that mattered more and is now simply recording the conversation for the historical record. The cave is 2 miles east, she said, past the dead oak, between two limestone slabs. I've marked it with a red cloth. The door will be open. She left. Dr. Prentice Holt listened to her for 3 minutes and offered her a sedative. Reverend Elias Cade said he would place his trust in the Lord's protection and shelter his congregation in the church, which was built on solid ground and had stood for 12 years. She tried 6 more families. Some listened politely. Some barely let her reach the second sentence. One woman laughed the short, sharp laugh of someone who finds the source of the humor slightly uncomfortable and wants to move past it quickly. By 2 in the afternoon, she had tried every door she could reach and had been turned away at every one. She stood on Main Street for a moment with the sensation of having done everything that could be done, and knowing it was not enough the feeling she had felt in field hospitals when the surgery was finished and the patient's fate was now in the hands of something beyond medicine. She looked north. The horizon had changed while she was moving through town. The clear sky she had left that morning was gone. In its place, building up from the north with the slow certainty of something that has made up its mind, was a wall of cloud, the color she had hoped she would never see again. Yellow. Not the yellow of late afternoon light or distant haze. The yellow of sulfur. The yellow of sickness. The yellow of an atmosphere that has been disturbed at a level far above where clouds normally form. Something deep and systemic, a change in the fundamental pressure of the air over an enormous area. She had one person left. Sheriff Harlan Voss was standing outside the bank, which meant he had been inside the bank, which meant he had heard at least some of her conversation with Mayor Price through the door. He was leaning against the post arms crossed with the expression of a man who has positioned himself to observe a situation he is not certain he wants to be part of. "Lenora," he started. "Margaret," she said. A pause. "Margaret, you need to stop this. People are talking about taking legal action." "Harlan," she said, and she used his first name deliberately because what she was about to say was not official business. "Do you remember the storm that killed Everett? Do you remember what the signs were beforehand? The yellow sky, the pressure change, the birds?" His jaw tightened. "I'm seeing those signs right now," she said. "Today, this afternoon, I'm telling you as the person who survived that storm that the same thing is about to happen here. Maybe worse." He looked at the northern horizon. She watched him look at it. She watched his face do something complicated, some negotiation between what his eyes were telling him and what his position required him to believe. "Go back to your cave, Margaret," he said quietly. She had one thing left to say. She had held it back for 2 years because she had not been sure she had the right to use it. Now she used it not as a weapon, but as the truth it actually was. "Everett called your name in the storm," she said, "when he couldn't see anything and the wind was taking everything. He called your name. I heard him until the very end." The color went out of Harlan Voss's face, not gradually, all at once, as if something had been holding it there and had now let go. He stood absolutely still against the bank post, and Margaret watched him absorb the words. Watch the particular way a truth lands when it has been kept waiting for a long time. She left him standing there. She walked back toward the cave. Behind her, Coal Creek went on with its ordinary afternoon. The men at the feed store finished loading the wagon. Smoke rose from the smithy. The general store propped its door open another inch against the last of the thin winter sun. She had tried. She had done everything she could do. She spent the last hour before the storm checking everything twice. She stacked extra firewood near the main chamber. She filled every container she had with water from the underground spring. She lit the oil lamps in their niches and laid out blankets on every sleeping platform. She tested the ventilation shafts one final time, holding her palm against the opening and feeling the air move across her skin, steady and constant and faithful. Then she sat at the cave entrance with Buck pressed against her leg and watched the yellow sky swallow the north. "I warned them," she said, not to herself, to Everett, to Stellan, to the particular version of the dead that we carry with us not as ghosts, but as the permanent audience for everything we do. Buck whined softly and pressed closer. At 3 in the afternoon, the storm arrived. It did not build. It did not escalate. It simply arrived the way catastrophe arrives when it has been organizing itself for long enough all at once, and from every direction simultaneously, as if the world had decided to stop being what it was and become something else without any transition. The temperature dropped from 28 degrees to 12 below zero in 22 minutes. Not 22 minutes of gradual decline. 22 minutes of something that felt more like physics happening than weather changing, as if the fundamental contract between living things and the air around them had been abruptly revised. The wind went from nothing to 65 miles an hour in less than 10 minutes. In houses across Cold Creek, people felt it happen. Fires that had been burning steadily suddenly changed character. Windows that had held for years against Montana winters began to shake in their frames. Sounds that were ordinary, the creak of a settle, the hiss of a kettle, the particular breathing of a house comfortable in its winter skin, changed pitch and became something else. Outside on the street, on the paths between buildings in the fields, on the edges of town, people who had not made it home yet found themselves inside something that the word storm was not adequate to describe. The snow did not fall. It moved horizontally with the speed and force of something solid, a wall of white, that replaced visibility within seconds of arriving and replaced air within minutes of that. Exposed skin began to freeze within the first 5 minutes. Lungs burned with every breath. Hands stopped feeling what they were touching before most people realized what was happening. Cole Harmon was inside the saloon when it hit. He waited 20 minutes watching the snow accumulate against the windows, was telling himself it would ease. When it did not ease, he buttoned his coat and stepped out the door to make the 50-yard run to his father's smithy. He lost his direction in the first 10 feet. The wind turned him around so completely that he could not have said with certainty which way was north or south or toward the building he had just left. He moved forward because standing still felt worse, and he moved for 20 minutes in what he later described as circles, though he had no way of knowing this at the time. No reference points, no landmarks, nothing but white in every direction, and the wind pushing him off balance every third step, and the terrifying awareness growing by the minute that his hands had stopped reporting on what they were touching. He walked into a wall. He followed the wall with fingers that could no longer feel the wood, found a door, pounded on it until it opened. He fell inside. It was not his father's smithy. It was the home of a family he barely knew 2 doors down from where he had aimed, which meant he had covered 50 yards by walking for 20 minutes through the storm and had arrived 8 feet from where he had started. He was alive. He was also missing significant portions of the feeling in both hands, Doctor. Prentice Holt was on the eastern edge of town visiting a patient when the storm arrived. His horse panicked at the first gust and threw him hard onto ground that had the consistency of iron at 12 below zero. He heard something crack in his left leg before he felt it. In the cold, the pain was slow to arrive. By the time it arrived fully, he was already unable to stand. He crawled for what felt like an hour through the accumulating snow, his useless leg dragging behind him, his hands finding purchase and losing it and finding it again on ground he could not see. His hands found wood, a fence post. He followed it to a gate, and the gate to a barn, and the barn door opened when he pushed it, and he dragged himself inside onto frozen straw and lay there while 2 terrified horses moved in their stalls above him, and the storm made the barn walls flex inward and then settle and then flex again. He was alive. Whether he would stay that way, he could not yet determine. Imogene Price was at the general store when the door blew off its hinges, not damaged, not cracked, taken cleanly by a gust that happened to find the precise angle between the door and its frame and apply the kind of force that reveals exactly how much the ordinary world relies on things going slightly less than their worst. The interior of the store went white in minutes as the snow drove in through the open frame, and the temperature inside began dropping toward the temperature outside with the casual efficiency of physics completing a task. She got behind the counter. She wrapped herself in everything she could find. She stayed there. She was alive. But the store without its door, without any way to stop the cold from entering, was going to become indistinguishable from the outside world within hours. In houses across Cold Creek, in barns and outbuildings, in the smaller structures that had always been sufficient for Montana winters because Montana winters were one thing, and this was something else entirely, people made the calculation that most of them had never expected to face. Their walls were holding, their fires were burning, but the drafts coming through the seams were different now. Not cold air finding gaps, but something purposeful. Something that moved through an inch of space, like water through a crack in a dam, and the fires were losing the argument. There was a cave 2 miles east of town. There was a red cloth between two limestone slabs. Most of them had laughed at the woman who put it there. The first to arrive was Willa Greer. She had been home with her parents and her younger brother Ned when the storm hit the west-facing wall of their house with enough force to crack the mortar between the stones of the fireplace. The smoke began backing up into the room within the first 30 minutes. Willa's father, a large and practical man who had never in his life been in a situation that preparation could not address, stood in the filling smoke and looked at the cracked mortar and said nothing, which was the first indication to everyone in the room that the situation was beyond his experience. "We have to go," Willa said. "We cannot go out in this," her father said. "If we stay here, the smoke will be a problem before the cold is. I know where to go." She looked at her father steadily. "Mrs. Holbrook's cave, 2 miles east, past the dead oak. I know the way. She told me the way." "That woman," her father said. The words carried everything the town had said about Margaret for 2 years, compressed into 2 syllables. "That woman," Willa said, "is the only person in this town who prepared for today." They argued for 5 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than they had. Then a gust hit the window on the north wall, and the glass cracked in its frame, and the cold came through the crack like a statement of intent, and the argument was over. They wrapped themselves in everything wearable. They tied rope around their waists, each person connected to the next Willa at the front. She had walked this route twice a week for 2 years. She knew the landmarks: the dead oak with the split trunk, the limestone face that came up suddenly on the left, the shadow between two slabs that looked like nothing from the outside. The walk that normally took 20 minutes took just over an hour. The wind knocked them down 7 times between them. The snow was so dense and so forcefully horizontal that opening their eyes into it was less an act of seeing than an act of faith, because there was nothing to see except white, and more white, and the particular darkness at the center of white that is not dark at all. Willa kept the wind on her left shoulder and kept moving and kept the rope taut and did not stop. They found the dead oak. They found the limestone face. They found the red cloth frozen stiff standing straight out from between the slabs in the wind, like a signal flag from a ship that had known this storm was coming. Willa pushed through the narrow opening and felt the change happen the moment she was inside. The wind was gone. Not reduced, not diminished. Gone. The screaming that had been trying to dismantle the inside of her skull for the past hour was replaced by a silence so sudden and so complete that it felt almost physical, as if the silence itself had weight and warmth. The temperature was 54 degrees. Her body, which had been bracing itself against the cold the way a person braces against a blow that keeps coming, slowly released the tension in her shoulders and her jaw, and the muscles along her spine, one group at a time, like a fist opening finger by finger. Margaret was waiting with blankets and a fire going in the main chamber and coffee on the grate. "I knew you would come," she said. Willa's father looked around the cave at the timber-reinforced walls, the lamp-lit niches, the smooth floor, the organized stacks of supplies at a year of mockery and dismissal, and 2 words at the saloon made into stone and timber in lamp oil by one woman's hands, and he did not say anything for a long time. "Get warm," Margaret told them. "There will be others." There were others. Ruth Calloway arrived 40 minutes after the Greers, moving alone through the storm, with 3 loaves of bread pressed against her chest under her coat, her face white and her fingers barely functional, but the bread intact because she had decided when she left the bakery that she was going to bring something useful, and she was not going to let go of it. She came through the entrance and held out the bread, and Margaret took it with both hands. Old Clem Briggs appeared an hour after that, moving with his cane in the unhurried pace of a man who had been through worse and knew it. He had walked 2 miles through a killing blizzard at 78 years old, using nothing but his memory of the land and the discipline of someone who had spent half a century underground learning that panic costs more than it buys. Storm felt the same as 47, he said when Margaret draped a blanket over his shoulders. Figured I knew where to go. A farm family named Henderson came next, parents and 3 children under 10, the father carrying the youngest against his chest and the mother holding the older 2 by their wrists. Their cabin on the south edge of town had begun shaking so violently in the wind, they had been afraid the walls would separate from the roof. The father said he had not believed Margaret's warning when she came to their door that morning. He said his wife had believed it. He said he was going to have to spend a long time thinking about the difference between those two things. By the end of the first night, 21 people had found their way to the cave. Margaret organized them the way she had organized field hospitals during the war, without sentiment and without wasted motion. Families in the side chambers, single people in the main room. She assigned sleeping rotations and cooking responsibilities and fire tending schedules, and put Willa's father in charge of monitoring the ventilation shafts, because giving a capable man something specific to do is one of the fastest ways to convert him from a liability into an asset. The fire burned steadily in the main chamber. The air moved clean through the ventilation shafts exactly as her father had described it would. The temperature held at 54 degrees. Outside the limestone walls, the storm did what storms do when they are very large and very serious. It continued indifferent to everything inside. The second night, just past midnight, someone pounded on the entrance. Not knocked. Pounded with the flat of a hand or possibly a fist. A sound that was different from the wind because it had rhythm to it, because rhythm requires intention, and intention requires a person. Margaret took a lantern and went to the entrance. Sheriff Harlan Voss was wedged into the space between the limestone slabs. He was not standing. He was leaning, which is what the body does when it has used everything it has to arrive somewhere and is now asking permission to stop. His face was the particular white of deep cold, not pale, not flushed, but white in the specific way that means the blood has retreated to the core and abandoned the surface entirely. His ears were gray. His nose had patches of dead white skin on the tip and along the ridge. His hands were wrapped around a child. A small girl no more than 5 years old bundled inside his coat so that she was wearing it more than he was pressed against his chest, with his arms holding her there. She was awake. She was not crying. She was looking at Margaret over the top of the coat collar with the large, exhausted eyes of a child who has moved past the kind of fear that produces noise into the kind of fear that is simply a fact of the body, like cold. Her name was Rose. Margaret would learn this later. Her parents had lived on the far eastern edge of town, a young couple who had built their house the previous spring and had died within 100 feet of their front door trying to reach the barn when the storm hit. Voss had been riding out to check on the farms when the blizzard arrived, and he had found the girl wandering in the white calling for her mother, her hands already showing the early gray of frostbite at the fingertips. He had wrapped his coat around her. He had turned his horse toward the cave, and the horse had made it 20 minutes before it stopped and would not move again, and he had carried the child the rest of the way on foot. 4 hours. 4 hours through 65-mile-an-hour winds and 12 below temperatures in zero visibility. A man with a child he did not know pressed against his chest and 2 fingers going black on his left hand, telling himself the distance was manageable and the cave was there, and the woman who built it would open the door. Telling himself these things the way you tell yourself things when the alternative to believing them is lying down. He had not come to be saved. He had come because there was nowhere else left to take the child. Couldn't leave her, he said. His voice was the voice of a man operating the very last portion of his reserves. Parents are dead. Found her in the snow. Margaret took the child from him. The girl came without resistance, settling against Margaret's chest with the boneless trust of extreme exhaustion. Then Margaret reached for Voss with her freed in hand. "Come inside," she said. She said it with no particular emphasis. No triumph, no performance, no acknowledgement of the 2 years between his last visit to her property and this one. She said it the way she would have said it to anyone standing at her door in need of shelter, because that was what the cave was for. That was what it had always been for. He came inside. She put the child down on the nearest sleeping platform and wrapped her in 2 blankets and looked at her hands and her feet with the trained efficiency of a woman who knew what frostbite looked like and what it meant when the color went from gray to white to the specific blue-black that was telling a different story. Rose's hands were red and swollen, but not gone. Her feet were the same. She would recover. She turned to Voss. His left hand was a different matter. The two middle fingers were black from the second knuckle down. The index finger was gray, which was redeemable, but only with time and warmth and the precise kind of care that asks the body to decide it wants to keep something it has already begun to release. She worked on him for 2 hours, doing everything she had learned in field hospitals and everything she had learned from 3 years in mining camps and everything she had learned from 40 years of her father's practical wisdom about what the human body can survive if you treat it with both urgency and patience. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at the two black fingers. He followed her eyes. "Am I going to lose them?" he said. "Yes," she said, because she had always believed that the truth, even when it is terrible, is less cruel than a comfortable lie that runs out before the situation does. He looked at the fingers for a moment, then at the child sleeping in the blankets. "I had it coming," he said. "Nobody has losing fingers coming," she said. "Not even people who deserve worse than they've gotten." Voss was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled in the main chamber. Somewhere in the side chambers, a child cried softly and then stopped. The storm pressed against the limestone walls, and the limestone walls did not move. "When I heard about Everett," Voss said, "dying in that storm, I was relieved." Margaret's hands did not pause on his bandages. She had learned during the war that the confessions people make when they are cold enough and scared enough and finally in a place that feels safe enough to release what they have been holding are the ones they have needed to make for a long time. You do not interrupt them. You let the cave be what a cave has always been, a place where the truth can be spoken because the stone walls will hold it. "Relieved that it was him and not me," Voss said. "He wrote to me, 6 months before the wagon train. Told me Montana was full of opportunity. Asked me to come with him. I said no. Too comfortable. Too settled." A long pause. "Every time I saw you, I saw the letter. I saw the man I left behind to D while I stayed home comfortable. I couldn't look at you without looking at what I'd done. So I made you something I could look down on instead." The fire shifted. Margaret finished wrapping his hand and set it down with the same careful deliberateness she brought to all physical things: tools, patience, stone. "Guilt is a weight," she said. "You can carry it until it breaks you, or you can build something with it." She looked at him directly. "Everett believed you were the kind of man who would do the right thing when it mattered. He wrote you that letter because he believed that. He was not wrong about you. He was only early." Voss looked at Rose sleeping in the blankets, at the small fist curled around the edge of the wool. "I want to keep her," he said, "if nobody else takes her." "Get some sleep," Margaret said. "We can talk about tomorrow when tomorrow comes." The third day brought the weight that comes when the body has stopped processing shock and started processing reality. 27 people consumed food and water at a rate that Margaret had not planned for because she had planned for 50 people for 3 weeks, which sounded like an enormous margin until you accounted for children who needed more, for people recovering from cold injuries who needed more, for the way fear makes everyone hungrier than they would otherwise be. She made the adjustments without announcing them, reducing portions by a calculation she kept in her head, distributing the reduction across enough different quantities that no single item made the change obvious. Imogen Price noticed on the morning of the third day. She had arrived the previous afternoon, brought to the cave entrance by two of her husband's employees who had found her in the destroyed general store and half carried her across 2 miles of storm-swept ground. She had arrived with nothing. No bread, no supplies, no useful skill, only the very clear opinion that the circumstances were unacceptable, and the even clearer sense that expressing this opinion was her primary contribution to the situation. "The portions are shrinking," she said in the main chamber where everyone could hear. "We're adjusting consumption to match our supplies and the duration of the storm," Margaret said. "We're running out," Imogen said. "We're all going to starve in this hole." The cave went quiet. 26 people turned toward Margaret because in a crisis, people look at whoever has been holding things together, not because they have made a conscious decision to grant authority, but because the body follows competence the way water follows gravity. We are not running out, Margaret said. We are being careful. There is a difference. You have no right to decide how much we eat, Imogene said. We are free citizens, not prisoners. Margaret looked at Imogene Price with the patient, unfrightened regard of a woman who had faced things that made this moment feel exactly as large as it was, which was not very large. You are guests in my home, she said. If you feel that the arrangement is inadequate, you are welcome to make other arrangements. She gestured toward the entrance where the wind could be heard, even through the limestone walls, a constant low note like a machine that is running continuously and has no off position. Imogene opened her mouth. She closed it. She sat back down on her platform and ate her portion without speaking. The fourth night, Margaret found Imogene alone in the far corner of the storage chamber, sitting on the ground with her back against the limestone, not moving, not sleeping, just sitting in the dark beyond the reach of the main chamber's firelight. Margaret brought a lantern and sat down across from her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. This was fine. Margaret had spent enough time underground to know that silence between two people in the dark is not always empty. Sometimes it is the most honest kind of conversation, the kind that happens before the words are ready. When Imogene spoke, her voice was different from the voice she used in the main chamber. Smaller, older. The voice of someone who has set down the thing they have been carrying and discovered that they are more tired than they knew. Abigail is dead, she said. Margaret did not respond. She waited. My sister. She lived in the Hartwell house on the edge of town, the one with the windows from Chicago. Imogene looked at her hands folded in her lap, and the motion was not the motion of a woman composing herself, but of a woman who has already come undone and is simply moving through what comes after. The windows shattered on the second day. She wrapped herself in everything she had. It wasn't enough. The lantern between them threw their shadows up against the limestone wall, two shapes that were quiet and still. I knew, Imogene said. When you started building, I'm not a stupid woman. I could see what you were doing and I could see why it made sense. She paused. Aldous explained about the surveyor, about the shelter site. He thought he was justifying himself, but what he was actually doing was confirming what I'd already understood. A breath. You were right. You were right from the beginning, and I knew it. And I went to your property with Agnes and Mabel and made you feel like something that needed to be cleaned up because I couldn't be seen agreeing with a woman my husband was trying to discredit. The storm moved against the walls. I chose my position in this town, Imogene said. Over the truth, and over a woman who deserved better. She looked up. Abigail didn't die because of the storm. She died because of what I chose. Margaret was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be felt. People die in storms, she said. Some of them die because they couldn't have known better. Some of them die because the people around them made it impossible for them to know better. The responsibility for that is real. A pause. But you're alive. And the question of what a living person does with a real responsibility is the only question that has an answer. Imogene looked at her. How do you do it? How do you help people who did what I did? Margaret thought about this, about the field hospitals, about the men she had patched back together who had done terrible things before they ended up on her table, and about the ones who had done nothing wrong at all, about the fact that a wound is a wound, regardless of the history of the person attached to it. Because the work is the same, she said. Whoever is in front of me. She picked up the lantern. She stood. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow is going to need you to be useful. Imogene looked up at her. Something in her face shifted, not resolved, not forgiven, but reorganized. The beginning of something that was not peace, but was adjacent to it and might with enough time become it. Margaret walked back toward the main chamber where the fire was burning and 26 people were sleeping, the exhausted sleep of people who have discovered that they are going to survive and are not yet sure what to do with that information. She checked the ventilation shafts. She checked the fire. She checked the sleeping platforms moving from one to the next the way she had moved through ward tents during the war. Quietly, efficiently noting each person the way a person notes something they are responsible for and intend to keep. Buck moved with her, his red-brown coat catching the firelight, his nails silent on the smooth stone floor. He paused at each sleeping person and considered them for a moment before moving on, and several of them stirred in their sleep and did not wake, only shifted toward the warmth. The way people shift toward warmth even when they are not conscious of doing it. The fire crackled. The ventilation shaft moved clean air through the chamber, in through the low opening, out through the high one, steady and silent and faithful as the same physics her father had described in a Cornish mining camp 40 years ago, reliable as the temperature of the earth itself. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cave held. The limestone walls held. The timber supports held. The 54 degrees held. Everything that was supposed to hold was holding. Part 3, What the Earth Keeps. The fifth day began the way the fourth had ended, with the storm and the fire and the particular silence of people who have been in an enclosed space long enough that they have stopped performing for one another and have become simply what they are. Margaret was checking the storage room inventory when she heard Willa's mother call her name. Not loudly, not with panic. With the specific, controlled urgency of a woman who knows that panic is a luxury that the situation cannot afford, who has made a decision to compress her fear into the smallest possible shape and present only the necessary information. Margaret crossed the main chamber in seconds. Willa was on her sleeping platform, her knees drawn up, her face the face of someone concentrating very hard on something that is asking more of them than they expected. She looked up when Margaret came through the entrance to the side chamber, and the look she gave was not frightened so much as determined, the look of someone who has understood that the situation has moved beyond the point where wishing changes anything. "It started this morning," Willa's mother said. She was standing beside her daughter with her hand on Willa's shoulder, and the hand was steadier than her voice. Early, she didn't want to wake anyone. Margaret crouched beside Willem and placed her hand on the girl's abdomen and felt what was happening there, what had been building since the early hours while 26 other people slept, and the storm pressed against the limestone walls and the fire burned in the main chamber. She looked at Willa's face. 7 months, she said. 7 and 2 weeks, Willa said. Her voice was strained but present. Margaret had delivered babies during the war, army wives who followed their husbands into the field. Camp followers with no one else and nowhere else. She had delivered babies in tent hospitals with artillery, audible in the distance, and in the back rooms of farmhouses, commandeered for surgical use, and once in the open air beside a creek in Virginia on a night in June when there had been no other option and no other hands available. She knew what a 7-month birth required. She knew what the odds looked like when the number was 7 months and the setting was a limestone cave in the middle of a blizzard. She stood. "I need Dr. Holt," she said to Willa's mother. "Boil water, every clean cloth you can find." Dr. Prentice Holt was in the main chamber, his broken leg immobilized in the splint Margaret had fashioned for him. On the first night, his 62-year-old body, having spent 5 days working on the slow arithmetic of recovering from cold injury and a fracture while keeping the intellectual composure that was the only thing he had left to offer. He had been of use in the ways available to a man who cannot stand unassisted. He had assessed injuries. He had advised on the distribution of the medical supplies. He had on the third night talked a young farmhand through a panic attack with the methodical patience of a man who had seen panic in many forms and knew what it needed. He looked at Margaret when she came to him and read her face correctly. "How far along?" he said. "Far enough," she said. "Can you work on your knees?" "I can work on whatever surface is available," he said. They worked together for 3 hours. It was not an easy labor. Willa was young and frightened, and the baby was small, in the way that 7-month babies are small, with the particular fragility of something that has not yet completed the last adjustments that make it ready for the world. Dr. Holt managed what he could from his position, his voice low and precise, directing Margaret's hands when his own could not reach, drawing on 40 years of experience that had accumulated in exactly the way experience accumulates through repetition and error, and the slow refinement of technique against the resistance of actual situations that never behave exactly like the textbooks describe. Margaret did the rest. She had the hands for it. 47 years old when she had last done this, now 52, but the hands had not forgotten. The hands remembered what the mind might have let go of, the exact pressure, the exact angle, the specific gentleness that is not the absence of force, but a different kind of force, more patient, more directed. When the baby came, she did not cry. She was there in Margaret's hands, impossibly small, the color of something that has not yet decided what color it wants to be. Not breathing, the chest did not move, the eyes did not open. 26 people in the connecting chambers heard nothing from the side room, where 3 hours of concentrated effort had just concluded, and the absence of the sound they were waiting for was its own kind of sound. Margaret cleared the airway. She rubbed the tiny chest with 2 fingers, the way she had learned from a surgeon in Virginia who had learned it from someone else, who had worked it out through the same process that all essential knowledge is worked out by someone trying everything available until one thing works. She bent over the miniature face and breathed into it gently, as if she understood that the difference between this breath and too much breath was the same as the difference between everything and nothing. The first minute passed. Willa was watching with the kind of stillness that is not calm but has used up everything that was not still. The second minute, Dr. Holt on his knees beside Margaret did not speak. Then the baby coughed, a single small convulsion, barely a movement more like a correction than a breath. And then she breathed. And then she cried thin and high and absolutely certain, a sound that cut through the limestone cave and reached every chamber, and every person in every chamber passed through the stone itself and into the bones of 26 people who had been sitting in the near dark waiting for it without knowing that was what they were doing. The cry of a child who should not have survived telling the world that she intended to anyway. 2 men in the main chamber turned their faces away from the fire. A woman Margaret did not know particularly well pressed both hands over her mouth. Cole Harmon, the young man who had stood on the edge of Margaret's property 2 years ago and announced the odds of her death as if it were a horse race, turned to face the limestone wall and stood there with his shoulders moving in a way that he would have preferred no one to see. Margaret wrapped the infant in the warmest cloth available and held her against her own chest, feeling the small, rapid heartbeat, the shallow, quick breathing, the extraordinary improbability of this particular life in this particular place on this particular night. She looked at Willa. The girl was exhausted past the point of expression, lying back with her arms out and her eyes half open, and her face containing a mixture of terror and wonder that no other combination of circumstances in human experience produces. "She's breathing," Margaret said. "She's small, but she's breathing." Willa's mother was weeping without making any sound, a talent mothers develop when they need their children not to see the full extent of what they are feeling. "What will you name her?" Margaret asked. Willa looked at the ceiling of the cave, the limestone above her, the dark stone that had sheltered her for 5 days while the world outside tried to unmake itself. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Word moved through the cave the way words move in enclosed spaces, quickly and completely, and within minutes every person in every chamber knew that a child had been born in the side room, and that the child was alive, and that her name was Hope. The effect of this information on 26 people who had spent 5 days inside a limestone cave during a storm that had been trying to kill everything it could reach was not subtle. It was the kind of thing that gets into the body before the mind has time to process it. The kind of thing that moves through a room not as an idea but as a physical fact, a change in the air, a shift in the quality of the silence. Margaret sat alone in the corner of the main chamber, apart from the others, and held the infant against her chest and let herself feel what she had not allowed herself to feel during the 3 hours of labor and the 2 minutes of nothing. She held the tiny weight of this child who had been born in the dark while a blizzard tried to bury the world, and she thought about Everett and Stellan and about the 15 feet and about everything that 2 years of bleeding hands and broken chisels and neighbors who had made her their particular kind of entertainment had been for. Not for this exactly, but for exactly this kind of thing, this specific category of outcome, a life that would not exist if she had stopped. She had not stopped. Buck pressed his muzzle against her knee. She looked down at him. His brown eyes were steady and present and offered, as they always had, the particular comfort of a creature who asks nothing except to be nearby. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." The 7th day. The storm had not broken, but something had shifted in it, the way the character of a long illness shifts before the fever turns something that is not recovery yet, but is the first suggestion that recovery is a direction that exists. The wind was still high, the snow was still moving, but the note of it had changed slightly, a fraction of a degree less absolute. And Margaret, who had been reading weather for 5 years with every sense available to her, knew what it meant. She gathered everyone in the main chamber. She explained what she had built and why she had built it the way she had built it. She told them about her father, about the Cornish mines, about 40 years of underground work, that had produced a man who could describe the temperature of the earth with the same confidence other men described the temperature of their morning coffee. She told them about the ventilation system, the principles that her father had worked out over decades in Colorado, and that she had applied to limestone formation in Montana Territory. She pointed to the walls and explained what the timber was doing there, and why it was doing it, and what would happen if it were not there. Dr. Prentice Holt listened to this with an expression Margaret had not seen on his face before. Not the careful, slightly condescending attention he had given her on Main Street when he was performing competence for an audience. Something else. The attention of a man who is actually learning something, which is a different posture, entirely more open in the face, quieter in the body. "This is all science," he said when she paused. "Everything you've done here is grounded in established scientific principles." "My father called it common sense," she said. "He said the earth has been keeping its secrets for millions of years. All we have to do is pay attention. Why didn't you explain all of this before?" He looked around at the people listening. "If you had explained the science, people might have listened." Margaret looked at him. "I tried to explain it," she said. "You diagnosed me with a mental imbalance on Main Street in front of half the town." She said it without heat, as a correction rather than an accusation. "People do not want to learn from a widow who lives in a cave. They want to learn from men with degrees. So I stopped explaining and I started building." Dr. Holt looked at the floor of the cave, the smooth limestone that had taken 6 months of hands and knees to create. Then he looked up. "I owe you a significant apology," he said. "You've been useful the past 6 days," she said. "Start there." On the 9th day, February 18th, the storm broke. Not gradually, in the way that large things end with a sudden subtraction rather than a slow diminishment. The wind stopped. The snow stopped. The sound that had been the constant background of 9 days, so constant that people had stopped hearing it as a sound and had begun treating it as the fundamental condition of existence, simply ceased. The silence was enormous. Buck raised his head. His ears came forward. He made a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a bark, something in between, and then he went to the cave entrance and stood there looking out. Margaret pulled on her coat and followed him. Cold Creek was buried. The rooftops of the tallest buildings were visible above the snow line, small islands in an ocean of white that reflected the morning sun with an intensity that was almost painful after 9 days of darkness. The drifts were piled in some places to 20 feet shaved by the wind into formations that had the smooth, indifferent beauty of geography, as if the storm had not been destroying a town, but simply rearranging the landscape according to its own preferences. But the sun was out. For the first time in 9 days, there was actual light, warm and gold, and falling on the snow with the generous abundance of something that has been away and has returned without apology. The people of Cold Creek emerged from the cave entrance, 1 and 2 at a time, and stood in it blinking, tilting their faces up toward it, and several of them wept, which is the thing the body sometimes does when it has been given back. Something it had quietly concluded it would never have again. Margaret did not weep. She looked at the buried town and began making calculations. "We need to find survivors," she said. "We need to do it carefully and in organized groups. More people die after storms than during them. Overexertion, falls, getting turned around in snow canyons." She looked at the people around her. "We go in teams of 3, one person who knows the town well in each group. We work from the cave outward and we come back every 2 hours." Almost Sheriff Harlan Voss, his left hand wrapped in bandages and missing 2 fingers, he would never use again, stepped forward. "I'll lead the first team," he said. Margaret looked at him. "I've been lying in that cave for a week while you kept everyone alive," he said. "I'm going." "Don't die out there," she said. "I put too much work into keeping you breathing." Something passed across his face that was close to a smile, though it was the kind of smile that contains too much other material to be simple. He turned toward the buried town and began to move. The rescue parties found 14 more survivors. A family who had made it to their root cellar and had been there for 9 days eating preserved vegetables and sleeping in shifts to keep each other warm. 2 brothers who had barricaded themselves in a grain silo with their horses and had survived by body heat, animal and human together in the practical democracy of emergency. An elderly woman named Clara, who had been buried in her house on the 2nd day when the snow collapsed the roof of the porch and blocked the front door. who had survived 9 days by melting snow in a pot. She held against her body and eating what she had in her pantry and sleeping every hour she could, because sleep is the body's most efficient form of conservation. They also found the dead, 8 of them. A young couple at the edge of town found 100 feet from their front door oriented toward town, which is where they had been trying to go. The drifter who had ridden into Cold Creek the day before the storm, with no warning and no shelter to go to, and no one to tell him where the red cloth was between the limestone slabs. 3 people whose houses had failed them in different ways and at different times in the 9 days. And Reverend Elias Cade. He was found in his church, which had held structurally. The walls were standing, the roof had not come down. But on the 3rd day, a crack had appeared at the junction of the roof and the north wall, and through that crack, so thin a knife blade would have had difficulty passing through it, the cold had entered with the patience and thoroughness of something that has no deadline. They found him kneeling at the altar. His hands were folded in the posture of prayer. His face was the face of a man who had been talking to God when the cold finished what it had started, peaceful in the specific way of a person who was doing exactly the thing they most believed in when the end came. Dr. Holt found the journal in the inside pocket of the Reverend's coat. He brought it to Margaret without opening it, which was the most tactful thing Margaret had ever seen him do. She opened it in the main chamber by firelight, with the people who were still alive sitting around her in the cave. The Reverend had called a hole in the ground and a pagan dwelling and an embarrassment to God's proper order. The last entry was dated February 17th, 1884. The handwriting was unsteady, the letters large and crowded in the way of hands that are fighting cold and losing. She read it aloud because it seemed to require being spoken rather than silently absorbed. I have been wrong about Mrs. Holbrook. I called her work pagan when it was providence. I preached that God placed us above the earth while she built a shelter in the earth that is saving dozens of lives. I prayed for God's protection while she built it with her hands. If anyone finds this, tell her, I understand now. The meek shall inherit the earth, and sometimes they also save it. God forgive me for my pride. The cave was silent for a long time after she closed the journal. Nobody tried to fill the silence, which was the right thing to do with it. The town meeting was held inside the Holbrook Caves 3 days after the storm broke, when the surviving population of Cold Creek had been counted and the dead had been accounted for, and the immediate work of rescue was finished enough that the larger question of what came next could be addressed. 41 people gathered in the main chamber. They sat on the sleeping platforms and leaned against the limestone walls and crowded together in the space that had been for 9 days the only thing standing between them and the storm's arithmetic. Children sat in their parents' laps. Old Clem Briggs occupied a seat near the fire that had been saved for him without discussion, the informal respect that accumulates around a person who has lived long enough that everyone understands they are sitting near something scarce. Margaret stood at the back of the chamber, near the medical station, next to the spot where she had sat on the first night and worked on Harlan Voss's frozen hands. She had not asked to be the center of this gathering. She had not arranged for it. She was there because the cave was hers, and because 41 people had collectively agreed without a formal vote that this was where the meeting belonged. Mayor Aldous Price stood at the front. He had survived 9 days alone in his wine cellar with a single candle and a jar of preserved peaches in complete darkness after the candle ran out, which is its own education. He had been found on the 3rd day of rescue dehydrated and disoriented, and he had spent 2 additional days recovering in the cave under Margaret's medical supervision, which had given him a considerable amount of time to think. He stood at the front of the chamber with his hands at his sides, and he looked at the 40 people around him, and he did not look like the man who owned the bank and the 3 best buildings in Cold Creek. He looked like a man who has had the things that made him feel large removed from him and has discovered in their absence what he actually is without them. I owe Mrs. Holbrook an apology, he said. We all do. He paused. Nobody in the chamber moved. 2 years ago, this woman came to our town and began building something none of us understood. We called her unstable. We called her an embarrassment. We said her work reflected poorly on Cold Creek. His voice did not break, but it thinned the way voices thin when they are carrying more weight than they were designed to carry comfortably. She came to my office the morning of the storm and told me exactly what was going to happen. I told her to go back to her hole and stop frightening people. He looked directly at Margaret across the length of the cave. 27 people are alive because of you. 27 people who would be dead right now if you had listened to us, if you had given up, if you had stopped building when we gave you every reason to stop. He paused. I have to tell you something I have not told anyone, he said. My land surveyor examined this property before Mrs. Holbrook purchased it. He told me it was the finest natural shelter site within 50 miles in every direction. I knew this. I had plans to purchase this land myself to build a community shelter that would bear the town's name. He stopped. I wanted to do the right thing, but I wanted credit for it. Mrs. Holbrook bought the land first and built the shelter without asking for credit from anyone, and I spent 2 years trying to undermine her work because I could not tolerate that she was doing correctly what I had only planned to do for my own benefit. He bowed his head. I was wrong about all of it, and I am sorry. The chamber absorbed this. Doctor. Prentice Holt spoke next, getting himself upright with his makeshift crutch and addressing the gathering with the deliberateness of a man who has been composing his words for several days. I have 2 degrees from universities that I have allowed to substitute for wisdom for the better part of 40 years, he said. I stood in the middle of Main Street and publicly diagnosed this woman as mentally unbalanced because she cited scientific principles I should have recognized and chose instead to dismiss because they came from a source I had decided in advance was not credible. He looked at Margaret. I am sorry for what I said on that street. I am sorrier for the effect it had. And I am asking your forgiveness, not because I deserve it, but because it's the only honest thing I have left to offer. Harlan Voss held up his bandaged left hand. 2 fingers, he said. That's what it cost me to do the right thing 6 days too late. He looked around the room. She saved my life. She saved a little girl's life. She did it knowing what I'd said to her and what I'd done. She forgave me before I ever asked because that's who she is. He stopped. I just wanted everyone here to know what kind of person built this place. Cole Harmon walked to the front of the chamber. He was 25 years old and he had the look of a man who has spent 9 days in a very small space with the memory of himself at 23 announcing the odds on a widow's death, and the experience had not been comfortable. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out everything that was in it, some paper bills, some coin, the physical remainder of a young man's savings, and he set it on the flat rock that served as a table in the main chamber. He did not say anything. He looked at Margaret. She looked at him. She nodded. He went back to his place. Then one by one the people of Coal Creek came forward. Some offered money, some offered labor. Some had nothing to offer but the particular kind of gratitude that has been standing in a coal place for a long time and is not sure how to come in from it. Margaret accepted each offering with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through 2 years of their contempt, because it was the same quality, the steadiness that had been there all along, and it did not need the gratitude to justify itself any more than it had needed the mockery to diminish it. Old Clem Briggs raised one hand from his seat near the fire. I've got a motion, he said. His voice was the voice of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment and sees no reason to be elaborate about it. I move that this cave system be officially recognized as the Coal Creek Emergency Shelter. I move that Mrs. Holbrook be compensated for every cost she has incurred over the past 2 years. And I move that we expand this shelter using her design so that every person in this territory has a place to go when the next storm comes. He looked around the room. Because there will be a next storm, he said. That's the only thing any of us can say with certainty about the weather. The vote was unanimous. They called it the Holbrook Caves. The name went up in bronze the following spring on a plaque at the entrance between the 2 limestone slabs where the red cloth had been. The years that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a place that has been changed by something and is working out season by season what the change means. The expansion of the cave system began that spring and continued for 3 years. Men who had never done a day of underground work hauled limestone rubble alongside farmers and blacksmiths. Women organized the supply rotations and kept the inventory and managed the food stores with a rigor that Margaret had taught by example. A schoolroom was added, a meeting hall large enough for the entire town, secondary storage chambers, a second medical station. Margaret supervised all of it. She taught limestone and ventilation and the constant temperature of the earth to anyone who asked, holding nothing back, because knowledge held back is knowledge that dies. and she had seen enough things die that she wanted no part of facilitating more of it. She married Dr. Prentice Holt in the spring of 1885. The ceremony was held in the main chamber of the caves, which was the only space in Cold Creek large enough to hold everyone who wanted to attend. Ruth Calloway was her witness. Little Rose, now 6 years old and settled into the Voss household, with the quiet adaptability of a child who has learned that family is something built, rather than simply given scattered wildflowers along the smooth limestone floor. Baby Hope, 11 months old and already regarded by everyone who held her as a child with opinions about things, was passed from arm to arm throughout the reception. Margaret was 53 years old. She had not expected this particular chapter, and she entered it with the careful gratitude of a woman who has been surprised by something good and does not want to be reckless with it. Every Sunday from 1885 onward, she held what she called lessons in the cave. Children from across Cold Creek and eventually from neighboring settlements came and sat in the main chamber, while she taught them to read weather, to identify medicinal plants, to understand what the ground beneath their feet was doing and why. She taught them the things her father had taught her and the things she had worked out herself and the things she had learned in field hospitals and mining camps and 2 years of solitary labor underground. She called it knowledge that stays. The children called her Grandmother Stone. She loved the name more than any other title she was offered in the years that followed, and she was offered several, including one from the territorial government that involved a formal ceremony and a letter from a man in Helena who had never visited Cold Creek and spelled her name wrong in the official documents. Harlan Voss retired from the sheriff's position in 1889. He spent his remaining years teaching survival skills to young people and helping maintain the cave system and doing the accumulated good works of a man who understands that the debt he owes can never be fully paid and has decided to spend the rest of his life in the attempt anyway. He adopted Rose formally and gave her his name. She grew up to become a school teacher. She named her first son Harlan. Cole Harmon never placed another bet. He spent 3 years as the foreman of the cave expansion, working alongside Margaret, with the focused intensity of a man who has found the most useful possible way to be a completely different person than the one he had been. He married a school teacher from Billings in 1886. He named his first daughter Margaret. When people asked him why, he always gave the same answer: because she let me in when she had every reason to leave me outside. Bayhope grew up with her mother Willa's curiosity and her own particular stubbornness about the shape of things and the reasons they were shaped that way. At 18, she told Margaret she wanted to study engineering. She wanted to design shelters. She had some ideas about improvements to the ventilation system that she wanted to test. Margaret gave her the journal her father had kept in the Cornish mines, the old leather book filled with Arthur Briggs' careful notes on underground temperature and airflow and the specific properties of different kinds of stone. The handwriting was her father's, small and precise, the writing of a man who took seriously the idea that the things he knew should outlast him. "Guard this," Margaret said. "Add to it. Your knowledge should be larger than mine, not merely preserved." Hope kissed her cheek. "I'll make you proud, Grandmother Stone." "You already have," Margaret said. "You did that on the night you were born." Buck died in the summer of 1890. He had been with Margaret for 11 years, which is a long time for any dog, and an extraordinary time for a dog that had survived what he had survived on the Montana prairie in the winter of 1879. His muzzle had gone entirely gray. He moved slowly. But he moved every day for as long as he was able, maintaining his watch at the cave entrance with the same patient vigilance that had characterized his entire life. On his last morning, Margaret carried him out to the entrance of the cave and sat with him in the sun. It was a July morning, the kind of Montana morning that makes people understand why anyone would leave Missouri and walk 1,000 miles into an uncertain future. The sky was the deep, clean blue that only exists at elevation. The grassland ran out toward the mountains in every direction, gold and green in the summer light. Margaret sat with Buck in that light and stroked his gray muzzle and talked to him the way she had talked to him for 11 years, quietly, without expecting a response, simply offering him the sound of her voice because it was what she had to give. She told him what a good dog he was, the best dog, the most faithful friend she had ever had in a life that had contained some faithful friends. She told him about the day she had found him in the snow, pressed between Everett and Stellan, still breathing, when nothing should have been breathing. She told him she had never entirely understood what had kept him alive through that night, whether it was stubbornness or loyalty, or simply the particular persistence of a creature who had decided that his people needed him and had refused to let that need go unmet. He died in her arms with his nose pointed toward the sun. She buried him at the entrance to the caves where he had kept his watch for 8 years. The headstone was simple limestone shaped and smooth with the same tools she had used on the cave floor. Buck, 1879 to 1890. He found me in death. He stayed with me in life. The best friend a woman could have. Margaret Holbrook died on the 14th of March, 1912. She was 80 years old. She died in the house she had shared with Prentice Holt for 27 years in the bed they had shared, with his hand holding hers. He was 89 years old, and he had the particular stillness of a man who is doing the hardest thing he has ever done, which is holding on without holding back. Her last words were Everett's name, and then Stellan's. She said them the way you say the names of people you are about to see after a very long time apart, with the particular quality of anticipation that is not quite excitement and not quite relief, but contains elements of both. She was smiling when she said them. The funeral was the largest Cold Creek had ever seen. People came from across Montana from the mining settlements and the farming communities and the towns that had been founded in the years since the Great Storm of 1884. Some of them had survived the storm in the caves. Some of them were the children of people who had survived. Some of them had simply heard the story the way certain stories travel across landscapes and generations, because they contain something that people need to carry with them. Governors and farmers, doctors and miners, children who had been born in the caves, and grandchildren of people who had sheltered there. A young woman from the State University who had been studying Margaret's ventilation design for her engineering thesis. An old man from a town 40 miles east who said he had built a shelter under his barn using principles he had learned from a pamphlet Margaret had written in 1898 and distributed through the Territorial Agricultural Office. They buried her in a chamber that had been prepared for the purpose in the cave she had built alongside a memorial stone for Everett and Stellan. The inscription on her stone was simple, the way the stones of people who have done large things are often simple because the stone does not need to argue the case. Margaret Holbrook, 1832 to 1912. Wife of Everett, mother of Stellan, healer of many. She turned tragedy into purpose. She turned mockery into grace. She prepared the way for all who came after. Below this in smaller letters, words that had been her father's before they were hers. The sky can turn on you in an instant. The earth keeps its promises. In 1978, a research team from Montana State University entered the Holbrook Caves with equipment that Margaret Holbrook could not have imagined and would almost certainly have understood immediately. They carried instruments that measured temperature to 1/100th of a degree, devices that tracked airflow in cubic feet per minute, cameras that could photograph stone formations in complete darkness with a flash of light faster than the eye could register. They had been sent by the university's Department of Geological Engineering to assess the structural integrity of a cave system that had been designated a state historical landmark in 1962 and was being considered for national designation. The lead researcher was a woman named Dr. Nora Whitfield, 41 years old, a structural engineer who had spent her career studying historical construction techniques and their relationship to modern engineering practice. She had read everything available about the Holbrook Caves before she entered them. She thought she knew what to expect. She was wrong. The temperature in the main chamber, measured by 3 separate instruments at 3 separate times of day, was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. The same in the side chambers, the same in the storage rooms, the same in the passage to the spring where the underground water still ran clear and cold and undiminished after 94 years. Outside, it was February. The temperature above ground was 14 degrees below zero. Inside the Holbrook Caves, it was 54 degrees, the same as it had been in July, the same as it had been in February of 1884, the same as it had been as far as anyone could determine for the entire geological history of the formation. The ventilation shafts moved air through the cave system in a continuous cycle, drawing fresh oxygen in through the lower opening and pushing carbon dioxide out through the upper one, exactly as designed. Exactly as Margaret had designed them, using techniques her father had described from Cornish mines that had themselves been operating for a century before he arrived in them. Dr. Whitfield's instruments measured the airflow and calculated that the system could support 50 people breathing normally for an indefinite period without any mechanical assistance. No pumps, no fans, no machinery of any kind, just physics. Reliable and indifferent and always present. The timber supports that Margaret had dragged 20 miles and installed by hand in 1882 and 1883 had done something that no engineer on the team had anticipated. Over 94 years, the limestone had grown into the timber. The calcium carbonate in the stone dissolved in groundwater and redeposited over decades had bonded to the wood fiber at the interface between the two materials, creating a composite structure that was measurably stronger than either the stone or the timber would have been alone. Modern engineering practice recommended replacing timber supports in underground structures after 50 years. Margaret's original support at 94 years showed no signs of failure. The structural analysis suggested they could stand for another century without intervention. She had built something that improved with time, but it was the final chamber, the deepest room in the cave system, that stopped the research team in their tracks. The walls were covered in writing, not painted, carved. Cut into the limestone with a sharp tool stroke by stroke, with the patience and deliberateness of someone who understood that what they were writing needed to outlast not just a season or a decade, but the indefinite future needed to survive whatever came next, needed to be readable by people whose names she could not know and whose circumstances she could not predict. Temperature records from the 9 days of the Great Storm of 1884, measured twice daily and recorded in Fahrenheit with the outside temperature alongside the cave temperature in parallel columns. Food distribution tables showing exact portions for 27 people across 9 days, with notes on adjustments made for children and cold injury patients. A technical diagram of the ventilation system drawn in cross-section, with measurements annotated accompanied by a written explanation of the physics that made it work. And at the end, in the same careful hand, a set of instructions for delivering a child in emergency conditions drawn from 47 years of medical experience and written with the specificity of someone who understood that the person reading it might have no medical training and no other resource and no time. She had known that paper would not last. She had known that books decay and documents are lost, and that the things people write on perishable surfaces are at the mercy of fire and flood and time. And so she had written in stone. She had written for people she would never meet, in a language that time could not erase, using knowledge that her father had given her, and experience that life had given her, and the 2 years of bleeding hands that had given her this particular wall on which to write it. Dr. Whitfield stood in that chamber for a long time. She brought in the rest of the team one by one and let them read what was on the walls, and each of them stood in the same silence that she had stood in, the silence that comes when you encounter something that is larger than you expected it to be and needs a moment to become the size it actually is. She wrote her report over 6 weeks. It was the longest report she had ever written, and the one she cared most about getting exactly right. Margaret Holbrook was one of the most innovative structural and environmental engineers of the 19th century, she concluded. She had no formal training in any recognized discipline. She had the knowledge her father passed to her, the experience she accumulated in field hospitals and mining camps, in the specific, contained, transformative grief of a woman who had lost everything she loved and decided that the loss would not be without meaning. She paused at this point in her drafting and thought about what she wanted to say next, because what came next was the thing that mattered most, and she wanted to say it correctly. What she built with hand tools and limestone in 1882 and 1883 represents engineering solutions that modern practice has not meaningfully improved upon. The ventilation design is optimal. The structural reinforcement has proven superior to standard practice. The thermal management is exact. The only meaningful difference between what she accomplished and what a contemporary engineer with a university education and modern equipment would accomplish is that she accomplished it 90 years earlier, and she accomplished it alone, and she accomplished it while an entire town was actively working to convince her to stop. She set down her pen. The inscriptions on the walls of the inner chamber are not historical artifacts in the conventional sense. They are active documents. The instructions carved into that stone are as applicable today as they were in 1884, and they are carved into material that will hold them for centuries more. She picked up the pen again. Margaret Holbrook did not only save 27 people in February of 1884, she saved everyone who has sheltered in these caves in the 94 years since. She saved everyone who will shelter here in the years to come. And through the stone record she left in the inner chamber, she is saving people she never met and will never know in situations she could not have specifically anticipated, using knowledge she carved into the earth because she understood that the earth keeps what it is given. The Holbrook Caves were designated a National Historic Landmark in 1981. The bronze plaque at the entrance, the original one from 1884, was restored and remains in place. The inner chamber with its carved walls is kept exactly as it was found because the team that discovered it and every team that has entered it since has reached the same unanimous conclusion without discussion. There is nothing to add. There is nothing to improve. There is only the stone and the writing in it and the temperature of 54 degrees that holds in every season and the air moving steadily through the shafts that a Cornish miner's daughter cut from limestone with her bare hands while her neighbors bet on the day she would die. The Great Storm of 1884 killed more than 200 people across Montana Territory. In Coal Creek, 8 died. 8 people who might have lived if they had been willing to walk 2 miles east and step through a crack in the rock. 8 people for whom the distance between where they were and where they needed to be turned out to be exactly as far as a pride can stretch before it becomes a kind of doom. 27 lived. 27 people who found a red cloth between 2 limestone slabs, who felt the wind stop the moment they crossed the threshold, who sat by a fire in the 54-degree dark and were kept alive by the 2-year labor of a woman they had called crazy, kept alive by knowledge that traveled from a Cornish mine to a Colorado silver camp to a Montana prairie, to the hands of a widow who had decided that the 15 feet between her family and survival would not be meaningless. Preparation is not paranoia. It is love made visible. And sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the only one who sees the storm coming, who reads what the sky is telling and the birds are telling, and the pressure behind the eyes is telling, who understands that the difference between the people who survive and the people who don't is not luck or strength or favor, but simply whether someone somewhere decided that this particular storm was worth preparing for before it arrived. Margaret Holbrook decided. She decided it with a chisel and a hammer and 20 miles of rough terrain and timber that weighed 200 pounds in 3 years of mockery and 2 years of bleeding hands, in the absolute unfrightened conviction of a woman who had already lost everything and had therefore discovered what she was when there was nothing left to lose. She decided it 15 feet at a time.